Hello and welcome to The Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on this Thursday, August the 10th. My name is Freddy Gray and I will be your host today. On the show this week, Vladimir Putin may or may not be winning his war against Ukraine, but is he winning the bigger spiritual war that he is waging against the West? Lionel Shriver has written about that subject in the magazine this week, and I'll be talking to her, as well as the writer Rob Henderson. And speaking of spiritual wars, the cover of The Spectator this week, here it is about the war on countryside pursuits. William Moore, The Spectator's William Moore, has written the piece, and I'll be talking to him about the ongoing lawfare against hunting, shooting, and fishing. And then we will turn our attentions towards America and talk about the bubbling story that is Hunter Biden and his dodgy past. I'll be talking to Ben Schreckinger of Politico about that ongoing scandal. And then we will come back to Britain and ask the important question, what is the matter with e-bikes? Peter Hitchens has written a tirade against electric bikes and a bit against e-scooters as well. And he'll be joined by Henry Mance, who's an e-bike fan. And Peter's been quite rude about Henry, so we'll have to see what those two have to say to each other. And finally, we're going to talk about sourdough. Julie Bindel, who normally writes about feminism and very important topics, has written an extremely popular piece on the Spectator's website about how much she dislikes sourdough bread. I'm a bit of a sourdough fan, so stay tuned for that clash. But before we get going, I'd like to give you a quick reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You will not regret subscribing to our YouTube channel. To do that, you click the subscribe button at the bottom of your screen and also tap the bell icon to make sure you get reminders and never, ever miss an episode. Now, Vladimir Putin is selling his war in Russia as a war just not against the Ukraine, but against a spiritually decadent and bankrupt West, a Western world that we all live in that is obsessed with gender debates, the denial of biological reality, and drag queens and LGBTQ issues, and so on. Lionel Shriver, our brilliant columnist, has a column in this week where she says the problem here is that Vladimir Putin has a point. Lionel joins me now alongside the writer Rob Henderson. Lionel, why does Vladimir Putin have a point?
Well, if nothing else, we are obsessing about things that are in the big picture small. And so it's distracting us from solving bigger problems. But I would also maintain that something like the transgender movement is significant. It doesn't pertain to that many people, although it does affect the way our children are being educated. But its significance really has to do with the denial of reality. And when you start denying reality, well, there's no natural limit, is there? I mean, if I were the former Soviets, I couldn't come up with anything better than the package of obsessions that we've come up with. And in the column, I mean, which I have to admit is something of a rant. It's a set of positions and attitudes that really come down to a self-dislike, a kind of burgeoning fifth column within the West that is destroying itself. And, one of those elements is the obsession with net zero, which is looking as if it's going to be quite a minority obsession, especially when it comes down to actually doing something about it rather than talking. Talk is cheap. But if only the West really gets on board, even assuming that all the climate change activists are correct, it's just all the sacrifice is not going to make any difference. And again, if the Russians were to come up with an ideology that would be perfectly designed to impede and even defeat the West, this is perfect. We're busy trying to convert to a technology we don't even have yet, really, and to make everything electric before we actually have the means of generating that electricity. It's completely insensible. And 80% of the world's energy is still based on fossil fuels, and we're acting as if virtually tomorrow we can live without them. Just across the board, Freddie, you sent me a really interesting clip of a Soviet dissident who defected in 1985, talking about how the KGB primarily had been trying to subvert the U.S. not through spying, but through ideological corruption. And it's almost as if that's what they've been doing. I mean, I feel as if, calling it woke now is insufficient. We're all sick of the word anyway. And it's just too small and too cute. This is something deep and terrible. I mean, this whole thing of having rejected meritocracy and now awarding all kinds of positions to people just because of what race or sex or sexual orientation they have. I mean, that is a recipe for self-destruction.
Yes. And Rob, it's not just Russia, is it? I mean, a lot of other countries are starting to see the West, America, and its allies in this way. China does to a certain extent. The BRIC countries do. And in fact, a lot of these countries in their various international conferences and so on talk about a geopolitical tipping point where American hegemony is coming to an end and we're moving into a multilateral world. And it's obvious to them that the culture wars, if you like, are a sign of Western weakness. And indeed, that they may even be trying at some level to stoke it. Have you seen any evidence of other countries trying to stoke the culture wars in order to prove that the West is in decline?
Sure. I mean, there have been some interesting pieces, especially during the riots and the demonstrations of 2020 of China developing bots and hiring individuals to post online on social media accounts to stoke contentious debate and to troll people and to essentially sort of cultivate hostility and animosity between Americans. And this is in their interest to do so. I mean, one of the things that Lionel pointed out in her column, which I found fascinating, was the body positivity point. I mean, this is something that this finding has been shown in multiple outlets. The New York Times recently covered this, but I'm still shocked at how little attention it has received, which is that the Pentagon recently released a survey showing that 8 out of 10 young Americans are ineligible to enlist in the military, primarily due to issues of obesity, physical and mental health issues, criminal records, and so on. So if 80% of young people aren't eligible to enlist, I mean, that in itself shows a sort of significant cultural decline. And we seem to not be so interested in what's going on with young people if we are to go to enter some kind of conflict with Russia or any other country, whether to support Ukraine or anyone else. It seems that we should be focusing on what has happened to young people, and instead we'd rather talk about body positivity and some of the other issues that Lionel points out.
Lionel, I was speaking to an admiral in the French Navy recently who was quite concerned. He wasn't a sort of right-wing lunatic by any means, but he was quite concerned about young people in France, and he talked about French people, he talked about British people and Americans too, and a lack of willingness, if it came to it, to actually fight. Do you think this taps into what we're talking about here, that Western people have sort of given up on our own culture or on what we are meant to believe in?
I think when the war in Ukraine started, there were some polls done of Americans anyway, and whether or not they would fight for their country, and the figures were appalling. I mean, very few. And that's what we're talking about, a kind of this package of distractions as well as self-doubting attitudes.
There was a recent, if I can just say, there was a recent
Yes.
finding from Jean Twenge's new book, Generations. She outlines the sort of characteristic differences of the generations in the US. And one shocking finding that she pointed out, and I wrote about this in the Free Press, which is something like 47% of Gen Z young adults say that America's founders are more accurately described as villains rather than heroes. Now, I know that if you're talking to British people, maybe they have some interesting thoughts about that. But at least young Americans thinking that the founders of their own country, nearly half of young Americans viewing the founders of their own country this way. I think this is indicative of something clearly going wrong with youth.
Yeah, it's a deep demoralization, and you can trace it back a couple of generations. It's been going on for a long time, but rather than just run its course, it seems to be gathering steam, and it's deadly on every level. And I think that there's very little to substitute for it in a positive way. All of the passions are negative. They're all filled with dread. I don't even think that there is a consuming, vivid vision of an ideal future that is powering younger people. A utopianism where we're all going to be equal and there will be no more racism and there's no gender roles and we're all just ourselves. I mean, you can kind of put together that picture, but basically what's in these people's head, as far as I can tell, is very dark, nothing but dread, and also an eagerness to put off adulthood. And of course, fighting for your country, that's the ultimate in adulthood. The weird embrace of not just of mental illness itself, but an eagerness to have a diagnosis of some sort, and the competition over effectively who's weaker, which is what the whole victimhood thing is about. Who can be weaker? Who can be more oppressed and therefore more powerless? I don't think all young people are like this. I don't. But we don't hear from the people who aren't like this very much.
Yes. Rob, I was going to ask you, to what extent are we just beating up ourselves unnecessarily? Because while there's no doubt that Vladimir Putin wants to stoke up the culture, wants to stoke up the resentment of social conservatives and Christians in Western countries, he's not the ideal ambassador of sort of the moral good. I mean, it's perfectly obvious to most Russians with a brain that he is himself a corrupt and almost certainly murderous figure.
Right. Well, just as sometimes good people have bad ideas, sometimes bad people can make good points. And I think in this case, in this instance, he's made some astute critiques. Often your enemies, your adversaries can be quite good at pointing out your shortcomings and your inadequacies in ways that friends can't or won't, because your friends have an interest in flattering you or buttering you up or perhaps overlooking some of your flaws, whereas your enemies can be very good at pinpointing where you're coming up short. And in this case, he has pointed out a lot of flaws that Westerners themselves have been speaking about for a long time. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if Putin himself was sort of reading a lot of the conservative columnists and commentators and just generally social critics across the social spectrum in order to understand what's going on in America and in the West more generally, and sort of harvesting the most astute critiques. And yeah, as Lionel pointed out in that piece, there are so many things going wrong in the country, and primarily seems to be led by members of the cultural and economic elite. I coined this term a few years ago, luxury beliefs, ideas and opinions that confer status on the upper class while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. And there are a variety of different examples, some that Lionel had pointed out. Body positivity was one that we had mentioned earlier, the net zero issue. A lot of the attacks and critiques on merit as well. All of these things do serve to make the people who are at or near the apex of the social ladder look interesting. It makes them look unconventional and gives them it confers a sort of status to them among their peers. But ultimately, when these ideas spread throughout society or when they're implemented into policy, these can have detrimental effects, not only for the people within the country, but perhaps, ultimately could potentially destabilize the world order if we're unable to stand up to villains like Putin.
Also, I'd add that this whole miasma of beliefs is contagious. And if I were Putin, I'd actually be a little afraid of it. If there's any, previously the Soviets were trying to corrupt the American culture, but American culture is now capable of corrupting other cultures. And I'm afraid that I have lived in the UK during the period that the UK has become infected. It is a kind of illness, and it spreads very rapidly, and the UK is now sick. It's sick with it, and it's obviously it's spread throughout the Anglosphere, and I feel confident it is spreading into continental Europe. The French like to think that they are immune to it, but they're not. It's already there. It's already in pockets. It's already fashionable in universities.
There's been some interesting research lately within the U.S. on young people who grow up in primarily English-speaking households versus immigrant households in which English is not the dominant language. And what was interesting there is that young people who don't speak English are actually happier and have score higher on life satisfaction and are generally less anxious and less depressed than children who are raised with English in the household. And one possible interpretation of this is that when you're relentlessly exposed to American culture, English-speaking media, and so forth, this actually does demoralize you and sort of undermine your sense of confidence and well-being. Whereas if you are not consuming so much English-speaking content and you're sort of in your little ethnic enclave in pockets that are sort of isolated from American culture, that may actually be better for your mental health and well-being.
But not Spectator TV, I should add.
Sure.
But
right.
Lionel, lastly, actually, I'll ask both of you this question. Lastly, a lot of Christians see this phenomenon. They see progressivism as a sort of substitute religion. A lot of non-Christians starting to regard it as a substitute religion. I wondered to what extent you blame what's happening on the decline of Christianity in the Western Hemisphere and the decline of sort of ideas of truth and so on. And are we running out of the kind of moral capital that religion gave us for so long?
That's become a kind of standard. I don't want to accuse you of saying things that are cliches.
No, it's all right.
It has become a cliche, actually, that the whole explanation for the rage of progressivism has to do with the fact that we don't have established religion to nearly the degree we used to, and that there is some kind of religious need psychologically in people that will fasten on to something in lieu of having a a well-defined faith, they'll find something else. And there's clearly something to that. My frustration on that point is that I was raised as a Presbyterian, and I didn't fancy being Presbyterian from about the age of 8. And I don't like to think that the only alternative to being crazed with progressive, excessive thoughts is necessarily another set of beliefs, some of which are a little weird and depend on stories that I regard as a little dubious. Why do we have to have either an established religion, which, of the sort that I rejected when I was a kid, or you have to go nuts politically? I mean, surely there's a way of believing in something and having principles and having some faith, not uncritical, but some faith in your own society and in your own future. Why do you have to believe something stupid necessarily? Is there some genetic need to believe fairy stories of some sort? I don't think so. I don't think that's the only way.
Well, at the risk of seeming delicate, I wouldn't necessarily say fairy stories, but Robert, I think maybe what I was trying to get at is relativism. Does seem to be the moral universe post-Christianity in the West, and relativism is very susceptible to the progressivism we're talking about, that is destructive and that does make people very unhappy and self-harming.
Right. Well, I think there was a brief period of relativism in the 20th century, as religion was on the wane, and relativism was a useful instrument to undermine people's belief in religion. But I actually do think that to some extent people need to have some sort of overarching belief. I'm not sure if it necessarily has to be religious or political, but they need belief in something, whether it's a sort of a civic culture or belief in some kind of stable traditional values or some kind of confidence in the country and in its customs. But in the absence of any sort of moral order, people, moral entrepreneurs can step in and start to tell people what they should be thinking or what they should be feeling or what they should be believing. And so after a prolonged period of relativism, some political activists stepped in and sort of gave people a list of ideas that they should be believing in and a list of norms that they should be adhering to. And a lot of people had no argument against it, and they were susceptible to it. And I think that is at least part of the story of what has happened, especially as religion has declined. It's possible that we can step out of this, but we would need to have some kind of story to replace it. I don't think that people can exist in a period of total moral relativism.
Yeah, the trouble with moral relativism and also with this progressive package, they both slide denialism. I mean, that's what I was talking about. The progressive package doesn't really have any positive content. And you were talking, Rob, about, something to believe in, which is not just believing what is bad, but also what is good. And that's really what's missing. It's all dark. And therefore, it's right next door to nothing matters. Everything is meaningless. Life is stupid. We might as well be dead. I mean, it's not a big step.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I remember when I was in school, it wasn't that long ago, the 90s and the 2000s, there was still a general, at least the school system the public school system in California, that there was this belief that the founding fathers were generally good, that Abraham Lincoln was good, George Washington. And, of course, we got the sort of simplified, maybe the fairy tale version of the American founding, but it was still something that kids could generally unite around and believe in and have confidence in. And now we're in the era of tear down all the statues, and Abraham Lincoln actually wasn't such a good guy, or he was actually just as bad as the Confederacy. And so now, even if you look at patriotism or confidence in the country, those things are rapidly declining. And so naturally what's left? Oh, well, there's the net zero, the climate change campaign. There's, maybe you can change your gender. Maybe there are X, Y, and Z, all of these other sort of newfangled ideas that people can latch onto, and people can be awarded some kind of moral plaudits for it in a way that, there's no other way to do so.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up there on that not tremendously cheerful note, but it's absolutely fascinating talking to you both. And thank you very much for coming on Spectator TV. Now, it has been almost 2 decades since New Labour banned hunting, and it was a big debate at the time, lots of controversy. But it appeared briefly during the 1990s that some kind of political settlement had been reached on countryside pursuits. But, as Will Moore, who joins me now, relates in his brilliant cover piece for The Spectator this week, the war hasn't stopped. And in fact, over the last 2 decades, people who live in the countryside feel that their way of life is being targeted by a process which is called lawfare, which is a word we're using more and more. It's a good word these days. It catches a lot. Yeah, it's like the new word. And could you just sum up for the viewers the various fronts on which this lawfare against countryside rural pursuits is happening?
Of course, well, it's sort of coming from all sorts of different directions, which is why it's very complicated. It's often very technical, and there's a lot of it. And what it essentially means is that without making these pursuits explicitly illegal, you just make it so difficult that in many cases it becomes almost impossible. And that's done through a variety of methods, lots of changes to licensing, often last minute, often extremely complicated changes, just to make all sorts of field sports extremely difficult. And the argument could be made, well, what's wrong with licensing? Lots of things require licensing. That doesn't mean that there's a sort of covert campaign against field sports. But the reason that a lot of people I spoke to for this piece feel very differently is twofold. One is execution, and the other is intent. So to take execution first, the example I start with in the piece are these changes to the licensing of the release of game birds in what are known as special protected areas in the country. And this was introduced by DEFRA and Natural England as a response to the avian flu. And it was sort of dropped in May, all these new changes, they leaving the shooting community completely scrabbling around trying to file the new paperwork for the new licenses they're going to need in order to release their game birds. No consultation whatsoever, sort of no warning about it. And there are shoots that are sort of, like, I know I speak to people in the piece, gamekeepers and so on, whose shoots are facing ruin because of this. And it sort of comes out of nowhere. It's incredibly clunky, sort of bureaucratic incompetence, really. But the other, perhaps more important question is one of intent. So are all these licensing changes being brought in because people want sort of proper management? Or is it because they disapprove of the activity? And the most explicit example of this is in the devolved government of Wales, which is a Labour government. Julie James, who's the climate minister, she said, "It is not my belief that a civilized society should kill a creature for leisure or an activity." Now, that's explicitly saying that licensing here is not to try and help manage the countryside. It is because it's a moral judgment. She does not like what it is that these people are doing. And so therefore, let's make it more difficult.
Isn't the problem then a more fundamental issue, which New Labour did not really resolve in 2004, which is that there are a lot of people in Britain who think that harming animals for fun or pleasure, and even if there are ecological, environmental reasons for doing so, is wrong. And then there are a lot of other people on the other side, perhaps a diminishing force in British life, certainly in British politics, who think that it's an important part of country life and the way people live in the country. That tension has not really been resolved, has it?
No, it's much worse. But here's a sort of, I think, is a fundamental point. When hunting was banned in 2004, when it was passed in 2004 and then came into effect in 2005, the argument was not about people enjoying themselves. The argument was it is cruel to the fox. The argument's now shifted. It's now this, as you put it, people don't like the idea that people enjoy it. So are we allowed to have abattoirs? Are we allowed to have butchers that kill for meat as long as they're sort of miserable while they do it? I mean, we're talking about some legal restrictions here. If you're trying to get someone's intent or someone's enjoyment out of an activity, then that is a sort of restriction on liberty at a certain point. It's no longer about cruelty to animals, which I hope everyone can agree is a bad thing.
Well, I mean, I suppose it depends whether you think killing an animal can ever not be cruel.
Well, okay, if you take the sort of maximalist position, I actually I disagree, but I sort of respect that as a sort of line of argument. And the people who go out to try and disrupt shoots or whatever, the sort of antis and the saboteurs, at least the shooting community they know where they stand with those people. The thing which I came across when I was speaking to all sorts of gamekeepers and people involved in the world of field sports is that organisations that are neutral, say they're neutral on shooting, such as Natural England and the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, they say they're neutral on shooting. People in the shooting world do not feel that way because of all the various sort of pressures that I've outlined. Now, whether people in Natural England or RSPB are actively anti-shooting, that's something which we can't know. What I think though is certainly true is that there is an ideological gulf here between the idea of what is conservation of consciousness and the proper methods of conservation. So for Natural England and the RSPB, they are extremely interested in rewilding and rewetting. That and any other form of conservation. The sort of more traditional methods used by gamekeepers. I mean, the big controversial one is rotational heather burning, and which Natural England and RSPB do not approve of. And so they just, regardless of motive, they just do not see eye to eye on points such as this. And a lot of people in the shooting world are very, very fed up with it.
And bumbling underneath it, as you suggest in your piece, is a kind of lingering class war and a sense that countryside pursuits are purely enjoyed by the upper classes and by people who have a lot of land. And as you said in that piece, yes, there are people with lots of land who like the pursuits, hunting and shooting and fishing. But there are also a lot of other people involved in it who are effective in a lot of jobs.
A lot of jobs. It's a very big part of the rural economy, the working economy. And, these are people who have often worked in land management privately for decades. They know the land very well. They often know the best way of taking care of it. And if the sort of Cold War over field sports were to become hot again, a lot of people would be very, very worried about their future and their jobs. And in terms of the sort of class war element, which you just mentioned, I think it's particularly true, of course, over concerns about hunting, and Labour's environment, the shadow environment minister said on Boxing Day of last year, with the Boxing Day hunts and so on, and he said he wants Labour to ban trail hunting, which is when you have hunting with a laid scent rather than any live quarry, because he says that he believes it's often a smokescreen for illegal hunting, where the fox is killed. But I think Labour should think very carefully about this, because would you really start legislating against something that might happen? So if you were to go out with your hound, and are you just making are you going to make that meeting itself illegal just because they might kill a fox?
Yes.
It's a sort of almost guilty till proven innocent assumption at that point.
And I suppose on the politics of it, this is something which the Conservatives in the past have benefited from. Labour's apparent hostility towards countryside life. Country life, I should say. And yet, as you point out, there's been 2 decades now of lawfare against countryside pursuits, which have been successfully persecuted lots of countryside pursuits. Tories have not done anything to stop it, really, have they? So It's another issue in which people who would naturally be inclined to vote Conservative are probably thinking, well, what's the point of supporting the Tories?
A lot of people in the country, I think, are not inherently very political people. They're quite sort of apolitical. They want to just be left alone with their pursuits. The reason they often vote Tory is not for any moment because they like the Tories. In fact, there is huge anger towards how the countryside has been treated over the last 2 decades. The thing is, they do fear a Labour government more, because they look at the devolved government in Wales, they look at the SNP in Scotland, obviously not Labour, but sort of on the left, where there's also a lot of additional legislation and additional ways of making things more difficult. And they see it as a sort of harbinger of what might come nationally if there is a Labour government. And it's why, Peter Mandelson, who I spoke to for this piece, he was sort of warning against this. He's saying, Labour can't sort of impose its kind of city ideas, its sort of majority city ideas on a rural minority, because it just doesn't understand the rural way of life. And Labour should not be a sort of banning, finger-wagging, intolerant party if it wants to try and win over the country.
William Moore, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Let's turn our attention to America and the story of the Biden family, and in particular Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. The international media, particularly the British media, I think, tend to focus on the Trump trials, and rightly so. It's a big story. But bubbling underneath that story is this story of Hunter Biden. I'm joined now by Ben Schreckinger, who is author of The Bidens, Inside the First Family's 50-Year Rise to Power. He also works for Politico. Ben, I'm very glad that we've got to talk to you, because quite often when we hear Americans talking about the Hunter Biden story, they are obviously partisan, obviously Republicans or Trump supporters who are banging on about Hunter Biden and the Biden crime family and so on. And as a result, I suspect the significance of this story has perhaps been lost. And I don't know about your own politics. I don't want to get into that. But you've approached this story as a reporter in your book and in your work. And I think it's fair to say it is a very interesting and potentially extremely significant story.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, during the 2020 campaign especially, Democrats really focused on Rudy Giuliani's attempts to make hay out of Hunter Biden's business dealings, contacts he had with people affiliated with Russian intelligence, all of that. And that was very much the impression that people on the left side here in the States had of this story, that it was sort of ginned up out of nothing by Donald Trump cronies. On the right, obviously, this has been a very big story and a very big focus for years and years. I do think now, especially in recent months, with Hunter Biden entering this guilty plea, with House Republicans getting testimony from a number of people, including a couple of IRS agents involved in the case who said there were irregularities, it's becoming a little bit less of a purely partisan lens that people are bringing to this. I think the press here in the U.S., outside of the conservative press, has been paying more attention to this in recent months. And I think that's only going to continue as long as Joe Biden is a candidate for president.
Tell us a little bit about that plea deal, Ben, because it seems to me there are different stories here. There's the Hunter plea deal, which relates to a case about a minor gun misdemeanor, which appeared to be letting him off the hook for various misdemeanors. And a lot of Republicans were very angry about that at the time when it happened just over a month ago. And then there's the ongoing investigation into his past and his business dealings, and that might bring in Joe Biden. How are those two stories developing? And explain a little bit more, please.
Sure. Yeah, it's very messy, and the status, especially of the Justice Department investigation, is up in the air at this point. 2 weeks ago, there was a hearing in Delaware. Hunter Biden was going to plead guilty to some tax crimes and get what's called a pretrial diversion on a gun charge. That deal was sort of thrown back to the drawing board by the judge. There appeared to be a lack of a meeting of the minds between Hunter Biden's side and prosecutors over what that deal meant. Hunter Biden's side believed and was telling people that this plea deal would signal the end of Justice Department investigations into Hunter Biden, interest in Hunter Biden. But prosecutors said, well, actually, investigations into Hunter Biden remain ongoing. They wouldn't say what those investigations pertain to. And there was disagreement about whether this plea deal would essentially end those investigations or not, or perhaps it's just one investigation. So the judge said, look, you need to go back to the drawing board. There was also issues about the way in which it was structured, whether it was being structured in a way to prevent the judge from being able to provide the oversight that she wanted. So we should find out soon whether or not they're able to piece that plea deal back together. And then in the meantime, separate from that, House Republicans are pursuing their own investigations of Hunter Biden. Obviously, they're very focused on trying to connect what Hunter's been doing to his father's office. They've had a parade of witnesses come forward, including business partners of Hunter Biden, a couple of IRS investigators involved in that tax case that Hunter's trying to tie up right now. And so all indications is that they're going to be keeping this front and center in their agenda for the foreseeable future, as long as Joe Biden is running for president.
And Kevin McCarthy, the Republican House Speaker, has suggested there might be a trial into impeachment proceedings. That's not the same as an impeachment, as I understand it, but that could happen quite soon. And the White House keeps saying that this is an evidence-free wild goose chase, and dismissing it quite aggressively. However, it's not really, is it? I mean, you've written this book about the Biden family, and there is no denying that there are lots of legitimate areas of concern about how the Biden family operated. And it seems to me you had Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's brother, James, or Jim, operating the business side of the Biden family operation, while Joe and Hunter's brother, Beau, who sadly died, were very much in the political field. To what extent do you think it was a family operation, a family grift, if you like?
Yeah, well, I think it's very clear that this is a family that's very close on an interpersonal level. And it's also clear that the Biden family has been integral over the decades to Joe Biden's political operation, political life, as advisors, as the people literally running campaigns, including his sister Valerie, who was a campaign manager for several of his Senate campaigns. His brother James was the chief fundraiser on his first Senate campaign. And then after that, you do have this pattern where various members of the Biden family engage in business deals that are raising questions going back to the 1970s in the papers about whether they're getting favorable terms on loans, for example, because of who their brother is, whether they're invoking, there are certainly allegations of business partners, some of them made in court proceedings, that they invoked their political clout as reasons that they would be able to land contracts, land business from people like labor union leaders. And what remains unclear is how much Joe knew about this. He said he's never discussed his family's business dealings with them. You've had people involved in those business dealings saying, well, that's not quite true. Tony Bobulinski has come forward and said, I, at least in general terms, discussed some business dealings in China with Joe Biden that I was engaging in with Hunter and James Biden. There's not evidence. There's not, anything like a smoking gun that Joe Biden has taken an official action because of or at the behest of a business partner of his relatives. But certainly there are questions about how much he should have known, whether he should have gone further in discouraging this, whether he should be publicly disavowing some of these deals that Hunter's engaged in. And so this is an issue that does not seem like it's going away for him.
And the latest big twist in the story is the congressional testimony of Devon Archer, who was a business partner of Hunter Biden, who has said that Joe Biden would be on as many as 20, I think, business calls that Hunter Biden was making with various, often foreign people that he was doing business dealings with. And Joe Biden was vice president at the time. And therefore, even if he didn't say anything, even if there's no evidence of him saying anything that might have been inappropriate, the very fact that he was on those calls is pretty significant, is it not? And I think no amount of kind of democratic poo-pooing of it can make that go away.
Yeah, it certainly shows that Hunter Biden's intention was to flaunt his access to his father, to make him look like an attractive business partner, often from people who were seeking a favorable reception in Washington, D.C. Another part of Devin Archer's testimony that stuck out to me related to a dinner in 2015 at Cafe Milano, which is a big D.C. gathering spot, an Italian restaurant in Georgetown, where when Hunter Biden's laptop materials first leaked, there was a Burisma executive, Vadim Bazarski, emailing around the time of this dinner to say, "Hey, Hunter, it was great to meet your father. Thank you so much," something along those lines. And there was emails about this dinner in which Bazarski was on the guest list. There's talk about getting Joe Biden there. And it's been a whole saga establishing whether or not those two crossed paths, as these emails suggested. The White House has said no meeting took place. Other people at the meeting have come forward at this dinner and said, we don't have any recollection of Bazarski being there. Devin Archer testified under oath that, yes, Bazarski was at this dinner as well, that what these emails suggest happened did in fact happen. And so there are issues like this where we're not getting consistent answers from the White House, for example, answers that are consistent with what other people are saying and what these emails are showing about the extent of intermingling of Joe Biden with Hunter Biden's business partners when he was vice president.
And it looks as though the Republicans are pushing towards an impeachment. Do you think that will happen?
I hate to make predictions about the future. I would not be shocked if they followed through on this. I would be shocked if Joe Biden were impeached, removed by the Democrat-controlled Senate. That seems very unlikely. But this is another tool that House Republicans have to keep the focus on this, keep the spotlight on this, and keep the spotlight off of Donald Trump's trials.
And forgive me if I'm peddling a Trumpist talking point, but I suppose one theory might be that if impeachment were to come up, a Democratic Senate might actually impeach Biden if by the time of the next election his public performances have become so bad, he is getting very old, that there is a desire among the Democratic Party to see him gone, and that the Hunter story might be a good pretext for doing that.
Well, I have not heard that theory floated. It's intriguing. I do think that there are a lot of measures short of supporting a conviction and an impeachment proceeding that members of a president's party would have to nudge them aside if they wanted to. So I personally doubt that it would come to that. But we're a long way away from Election Day, and there's a lot of moving pieces, and so fireworks of some sort in this election are almost guaranteed.
Ben, we'll leave it there, but thank you very much for joining us. Now, let's talk about e-bikes or electronic bicycles, which seem to be a divisive topic. Peter Hitchens has written a typically forthright piece in the magazine this week about how much he dislikes them, and I'm joined by him now. Hello, Peter.
Morning.
I'm also joined by Henry down the line, Henry from the Financial Times, Henry Mance, who is a fan, a supporter of e-bikes. Peter, I'll start with you because you wrote the piece. You're an enthusiast for cycling, as you say in the piece, but you really don't like e-bikes.
No, they're a fraud. They look like bikes. They make people think that they're riding bikes, and they also are allowed into the cycle lanes, which it took decades of campaigning to get, which are supposed to be free of motor vehicles, and they are motor vehicles. They're bike-shaped objects, but they're actually motorbikes, and many of them can go extremely fast, and many of them are very heavy indeed. And so the whole battle, which I took part in, which took perhaps 40 years to get special spaces on the roads for human-powered, lightweight, silent, clean bicycles has now been tossed to one side, so these horrible things can go whizzing and whining along bike tracks at excessive speeds, and we aren't safe anymore.
And you think people should have a license to ride one?
Well, they are motor vehicles, and all motor vehicles in this country until very recently, until I think Grant Shapps was the Secretary of State for Transport, had to be ridden by people who were licensed. And now this has been dropped, both for e-bikes and for their hideous cousins, the e-scooter, with results which I think will carry on bothering us for many years to come. And people will wonder in times to come why we were so stupid as to make these things legal and to allow people to ride them without any serious qualification. I have a motorcycle license, and it's quite a hard thing to get. And they're actually quite hard things to ride. And I think if you're going to ride motorbike, you should learn how to do it and get a license.
Have you been on an e-bike? Have you tried it?
No, they give me a red mist as soon as I see them. I can't see any points in them. If I wanted to use motor vehicles, I would, but I deliberately gave up motor vehicles as far as I could many years ago. And why should I start doing so because someone's produced a motor vehicle that looks like a bicycle and isn't?
Henry, you are mentioned in this piece. I think you are described as being typical of metropolitan trendies who ride e-bikes. How do you respond to this charge?
I mean, I take it as a huge compliment, Freddie, and rarely. But I think Peter's problem is that he's too young and fit and full of energy, and he doesn't quite appreciate the role that e-bikes can play. It's actually quite nice to discuss this topic because, as you say, it's very divisive. But it's nice to discuss it with someone like Peter who gets the principle and who is on board with changing what our cities look like, rather than someone who just wants to continue throwing more cars down the same streets, which I think has had lots of bad effects. And really, whether you're on the left or the right, there should be a good case for cycling and active travel being a bigger part than more SUVs, etc. But I think Peter's wrong to say that these are basically motorbikes. The real difference with an e-bike is you still have to pedal to get any support from the motor. So you can't just sit on it and whiz up a hill. But these bikes, although they're a bit sturdier than the pedal bike you might be used to, they're not a motorbike, right? A line bike, which people will see around London, weighs about 35 kilograms. A motorbike would be 10 times that. And, a Volkswagen Golf is over a ton. So really, these things do still belong in the segregated cycle lane. And what I think they really do is open up cycling to a whole range of people who don't have Peter's energy, who live on a hill. London is not Amsterdam. We can't change the geography. We need to get more people cycling, and offering them a bit of assistance, making it a bit less hard work, is one way of doing that.
Except that it isn't. You may have to actually turn the pedals to get an e-bike to go uphill, but you're not doing what I'm doing when I go uphill. I often have to stand on the pedals to go uphill, but I know that it's extremely valuable exercise. It's sweet of you to call me young. I am, in fact, nearly 72. But the truth is that if I am fit, then it's because I have been doing the hard business of pedaling a powerless bicycle for many years, often uphill. And if people want fitness from bicycles, they have to do that. And there's no point to taking any e-bicycle. I'm overtaken by them all the time, by people who obviously haven't been, as I've been, cycling for decades, who just get on them and can achieve speeds without any real serious effort that it takes me a really major effort to get to. They are not even remotely comparable in their ability to provide exercise to proper bicycles. And they may not be as heavy as motorbikes, I agree with you about that, but the ordinary ones, the ones I'm constantly picking up from where they're dumped on the pavement, weigh 2.5 times as much as an ordinary bicycle. And the great big cargo machines can be about 5 times as much. And these really are very powerful motor vehicles, but they are motorbikes because they are bicycles which have a motor. They're possibly more comparable to the things which were actually called mopeds probably 40 or 50 years ago. The word is now widely misused, and there were motor-assisted bicycles. But you had to have a license for those. And again, you had to pedal them, but the pedals did a little bit, but the motor did most of it. Let's not pretend the motor is doing most of the work. Without the motor, the things would be simply too heavy to ride.
What I sense is, I think when anesthesia came along in the 19th century, there were some doctors who opposed it on the basis that people should suffer, and it was a good idea to get a sense of their pain. It was helpful for the medical process. think some of that may still be around in the way we approach childbirth, but and that's kind of the attitude that I see seeping through from some traditional cyclists towards e-bike. The idea that cycling should be a very active thing. It should be hard on a rainy day. It should be hard to go up a hill. This will get you fit. And the problem is that a lot of people just haven't warmed to that. I mean, I'm very happy to go out on a normal bike as well as an e-bike. I enjoy it. But a lot of people just haven't wanted to do that. They've got in their cars instead. And so how do we get them out of their cars? We offer them a slightly easier cycling experience.
Well, there's many ways of getting people out of cars. The principal one, which of course the Swiss are very good at, is providing first-rate public transport. That gets people out of their cars. You're never going to get an awful lot of people immediately to start cycling. What a lot of people don't realize is, I think, the Dutch, until about the late 50s and early 60s, were just as car mad as we were, and their cities were just as car congested. They took an actual decision as a government and a people to turn away from this and to promote cycling. And it's taken many, many years to get to where they are now. And of course, they have the curse of the e-bike too, which is strongly opposed by many Dutch cyclists because they don't want these things in cycle lanes. But the truth is that it will take a long time. It's nice to do with anesthetic. And one of the reasons I don't ride a motorbike anymore is that I had a very bad accident on one, and I was lying by the roadside in considerable pain. I was very glad when I got anesthetic. It's not remotely comparable to the minor discomfort you feel when you pedal a bicycle uphill. It's silly, a non-comparison. So let's not have it. People, it's true that cycling is a bit difficult, and quite a lot of people find things that are a bit difficult, too hard to do. Well, okay, let them, if they want to ride motor vehicles, ride on the road. I don't mind if they want to ride these things about on the road. It's if they come whizzing along on cycle tracks, and you're supposed to go at 15 miles an hour, and they're supposed to be governed by little widgets which don't let them go any faster. But it's horribly widely known that these things can be tweaked, and you can go far faster than that, and everybody knows that they do. And so here you have, on cycle lanes, objects which look like bicycles tearing by at perhaps 30, even 35, 40 miles an hour, very heavy. If they hit you, you'll be very badly hurt. And the whole purpose of the cycle lane, to segregate the vulnerable cyclist, a human frame on a small, lightweight machine, from heavy traffic, has been undermined in a matter of, I think, 2 years. It's gone from bliss being on cycle lanes in London to being an absolute nightmare.
Henry, is the problem not just what's going on the lanes, but the clutter outside the Spectator's office at the moment? There are 3 human forests, which is one of the rental systems, if you like, of e-bikes in London. And that's what people object to the most. I suppose this question applies to both of you, is that they do clutter up pavements. There are e-bikes everywhere. There are also e-scooters everywhere. Is that a problem, do you think?
Yeah, and I think that we should hunt very hard for the 3 Spectator journalists who have left those bikes outside the office. But no, I think you're right, and I think when these new technologies come along, they do bring teething troubles. I mean, do you remember when mobile phones came along and everybody was talking very loudly in train carriages, and it seemed like our future would be a complete hell of listening to other people's mobile phone conversations, and we sort of developed norms around that. And everyone texts now anyway, so no one ever picks up the phone. And I do think that some of the complaints around e-bikes are things that we could manage a bit better. In Paris, and Peter knows the case very well, but in Paris, they've just had a referendum on banning not e-scooters, but e-scooter rentals, on the basis that people who own their own e-scooter, they tend to be fairly responsible with it, and they stick to the rules, and they don't have 2 or 3 people going on the same scooter, and they don't leave it lying around on the pavement. But people who rent one from a company like Lime, they may be a bit more carefree about it and a bit sort of not such good citizens. And I think the clutter is a real problem. If you're in a wheelchair, or if you're trying to just walk down a pavement, then they're a nuisance. So finding a way in which there's designated parking areas and people have to pay very high fees if they don't leave it in those parking areas, that seems to me the way forward. But it doesn't seem to be an insoluble problem that you should throw out e-bikes altogether.
Well, why were they licensed in the first place? They were completely illegal until quite recently, and suddenly there's an explosion of them. It's not a question of throwing them out. The real argument is why we took this step, which is still, in my view, reversible, and whether it was wise to do. It's not just, I have to say, on cycle lanes that these things would be found. I was quite near Bracken House, your wonderful offices, a few months ago, and I was nearly sent to my reward by an e-bike, which must have been doing 30 miles an hour along the pavement in the city of London. Fortunately, I still have enough of a sense of hearing to notice it coming, but it was very close round thing. And that's the second time in my life that I've come close to being erased by an e-bike. They are dangerous. And they, as I say, they're not properly licensed, they're not properly regulated. Anything of this level of danger in any other area of life would be regulated, and so it's licensing. These things are just allowed out everywhere, and they are growing in number. Every day there are more of them. And if nobody does anything about it soon, we are going to regress it. And here I am just making this point, and also trying to get cycling campaigners who have accepted them in a rather open-mouthed way to see that there is a huge difference between a human-powered silent machine and a heavyweight motorbike capable of 30 or 40 miles an hour. And they shouldn't allow them to be mixed up, and they shouldn't be allowed on cycle lanes, and they also shouldn't be allowed on pavements. One other thing which we need to do, of course, is to introduce a fantastic idea in this country, which I think other countries have, which is called a police force. You hire people to enforce the law, and you make them walk around the streets stopping people who break the law. We don't have one of these, at least if we have, I haven't seen any trace of it. But if we have one of those, then we can obviously sort this thing out.
On that emphatic note, I think
I actually agree with you on that. That where is the enforcement? Where is the enforcement of bad driving everywhere? But let me give you an example. I mean, I have a normal bike which I will take occasionally into the office, but I'll take around town. And then if I want to go somewhere with my kids, then I put them on the back of a cargo bike. They get strapped in, and it's only possible with the motor.
Let's not get started on cargo bikes. Let's not do that. That's a whole other debate. We'll do that in the next edition. But Henry and Peter, thank you very much for coming on Spectator TV. It's an enjoyable debate. Now let's talk about sourdough. Julie Bindel, who joins us here, a much-loved Spectator contributor, has written a piece, and it's on our website, called "Just Say No to Sourdough," and the stand first is "Put it in the bin." And this piece has gone bananas on the internet. I think it's fair to say it might be our most read piece of the year so far. And it's a vicious attack, really, on sourdough bread. Let's start with the obvious question. What's your problem with sourdough?
Everything. Look, first of all, I'm delighted that it's doing so well, but sometimes I put huge amounts of time and effort, blood, sweat and tears, writing about awful violence against women and girls, terrible unsolved crimes, and sourdough does better than that.
Yeah.
I'm going to become a food critic.
You're not saying you didn't put an enormous amount of effort.
Huge amount. But this is actually quite funny because it's been brewing in my head for a long time, and I've been kicking off about it with my friends, in restaurants, even in bakeries, high-end bakeries where I live in Cruchon, Crouch End, where everywhere I look there's just sourdough, people asking for sourdough, restaurants with different cuisines, all serving it. And so my problem with sourdough, twofold. First, I don't like its taste or texture, which is pretty kind of basic. And secondly, it's become a little bit like, I suppose, 1986 in East Berlin before the wall came down, where you were queuing for bread and there was one type of bread, and that was it. This is East Berlin in 1986. Yes. It's colonized the entire bread world. I'm old enough to remember the kiwi fruit fad in the 1980s. Every single dish that you ordered in every restaurant had a slice of this abomination on top of it. Ugly, it tasted vile, and it was just seen as something that you couldn't serve a meal without. And then all of a sudden it dropped off the radar, and everybody went back to, rightly so, hating kiwi fruit. With sourdough, it's different, because obviously it was going to be a type of bread that some people would really like. It suits their palate, it suits why and how they eat bread. But during lockdown, and there was a big yeast shortage in 2020, the recipe went viral around all of these bored people working from home or furloughed and had too much time in their hands. And it was, guess what? You can make this type of bread, the type of bread that you get in these posh, very upper middle class, North London bakeries without yeast. So that then did the rounds on Instagram, and people were no longer posting their photographs of their holidays and their meals out in restaurants and their nights stocious in bars. And so all of a sudden we started to see these really ugly pictures of over-baked, crusted bread with massive cracks in them and people holding them out like some burned offering, and even bringing them round and leaving them on the doorstep because, of course, we couldn't, social distancing. I opened my door once and there was a loaf of bread and a text message from a friend saying, "Thought you'd like this." And I thought, well, okay, I've never liked this stuff, but how kind of her to do this.
Yeah.
So I tried to eat it with soup. No chance, because it's so hard and the crust is so uncompromising that you can dip it in soup. The soup just falls off it back into the bowl. It won't absorb it. So I tried to dip it in a bit of olive oil and had it with some snacks. That wouldn't work because it won't absorb the olive oil. And of course, trying to make a sandwich with it, you would honestly need a jaw this size, and you would be chewing it forever, and then you'd need to go to the dentist, and it was locked down and there were no dentists open. So I thought maybe after lockdown it will start to get unpopular. Maybe people will have had enough. It's actually got even more stratospherically popular amongst people. Why?
Well, I think I could answer that question a little bit because your piece hurt my feelings slightly, because I am, as you would put it, a bread bro. I'm a bread bro.
But you don't look like one, to be fair.
I've never tried to be a kind of hipster or anything like that. But what happened is a few months ago, I went to a friend's house and we had some bread in the morning, and I said, "This is very delicious," and she said, "Oh, I'll give you some of my starter," which, as you know, as you said, is the
foul-smelling
culture. Yeah. So she gave me some, and I put it in the cart, and I didn't really think I was going to actually use it. I just took it. But then, quite bored that evening, I decided to give it a go, and I realised it's actually incredibly easy, and you get a lot of compliments for doing something that's incredibly easy. And I also think looking after the mother, the starter, is a bit like gardening. It has its own pleasure because you're looking after a live culture. But anyway, as a result, I've actually brought, because I do bring it into the office.
Oh dear,
and
you
I
don't have
forced
any
people
nerve, do you?
to make
Oh
polite
no,
comments
here's one you
about it.
prepared earlier.
And so I'm not sure we've ever done this on SpectatorTV before, but here is it's not going to look very nice. But here is some sourdough bread that I'd made.
I'm here under false pretenses.
You've been
I was not
snuffed up.
told that this was part of my punishment.
And then do you want butter?
I will try a little bit of butter because that's the only way that it might actually slip down.
Yeah, okay, we'll put lots of butter on it. And then you don't have to eat all of it, but just have a taste.
I will have a taste.
Because you complain about how hard the crust is.
Well, the thing is that what I found was when I was eating sourdough is that the taste of blood doesn't really go well with bread, and that's what was happening. I actually had a mouth injury. Thank you very much. I had a mouth injury.
Which you haven't recovered from.
Which it actually a cut here on my lip from trying to chew a bit of sourdough that a colleague bought me.
Yes.
Thinking that I would like it because everyone else does. Okay.
Here it is. You've changed your line completely. I can't wait for the reaction.
It's very nice.
Great. This is like Paul Hollywood reviewing a cake.
It's very nice, but no disrespect.
None taken.
This is very different from the high-end bakery sort. Better, of course.
Thank you.
Where you have to take a chisel to get through to it, where your bread knife buckles.
Yes.
And where you cannot possibly chew the contents of that in any fewer than, say, 10 solid minutes and 2 lost fillings. So that, I would just say, is a nice loaf of bread. Why can't they all make it like yours?
There we go. Maybe I should open a bakery.
That I think that they want the masochistic. See, that's where I think the machismo comes in. I think that they want the massive, thick, heavy, dark, cracked crust. I think they want the huge, dense insides because it's a bit like the kind of massive ribeye steaks that some men get really into.
Yeah.
You see them in steakhouses where they order the huge 900-gram piece of steak with a huge bone going through it, and they're chewing away for hours and drinking a red wine you could slice in half. I think that's part of that eating culture.
Is there a streak of misandry here in that it's things that men tend to fixate
Without
on?
question.
Like,
I mean, look,
beer, like brewing beer, for instance. And you're right, that men got obsessed with, well, a lot of men get very obsessed with making beer. And there was this big fan for hoppy, lots of hops in your beer. and people took it such an extreme.
Yeah.
That some beer was just revolting.
I think I say in the article that it's a bit like the dude bros. You really are not one of those.
That's
First of all,
what
you're
you're
much
like.
nicer. You have a much tidier appearance than these guys. They use beard oil and they have man buns and they look like 18th century carpenters, right? These men. And they also like the really extreme chili-infused cocktails. They're like kimchi and fermented stuff, like fermented to next door and back.
Yeah,
So they're going for these extremities. You're absolutely right. And I think that's how sourdough has become a parody of itself. That, to me, tastes like a nice slice of Greek country bread. You know, it's not, well, to be honest, it's not sour.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'm doing it wrong. But thank you very much for trying it and for being so polite. You can go and throw up now.
It's my pleasure. It's a nice, tasty piece of bread.
On that delicious note, I think we'll end Spectator TV for this week. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Do that by clicking that subscribe button and then the bell icon. And we'll see you again next week.